Let's get the thoughts now of Megan Richards, who is a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which is a think tank that focuses on transatlantic relations. Also former head of energy policy at the European Commission, and joins us now from Brussels. Welcome to World Business Report. It's good to have you with us. Talk to me first of all, if you will, because there's a lot of conflicting information about just how reliant Europe is on Ukraine and the pipelines that pass through the country. Some suggesting our dependency has been reduced since the 1990s because there are other sources, other ways of getting that energy through. Do you agree with that we are less dependent now than we once were?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. There are a number of diverse and new pipelines and new sources of gas, including, of course, LNG from the United States, from Qatar. Russia contributes for the moment about 40% of the EU's gas supply, but also with the recent efforts to diversify not just sources of energy, which includes gas, but diversify the nature of energy to use more renewables, to find more domestic sourcing of renewables. This has changed also the nature of energy since 1990, and interconnections between countries have increased quite significantly, both with electricity and with gas. So there is a rather different picture now than there was in the past. There's the new Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which of course is bringing gas from Azerbaijan. The Norwegian gas continues to come, Algerian gas. As I mentioned already, US LNG is now coming on stream quite a bit faster. The US has ramped up dramatically its LNG contributions. But of course, that's a small amount compared to the huge amounts that come through the pipelines. And the transit through Ukraine has been important for Ukraine, but of course also for Europe. I think about 6 years ago, there were 6 EU member states who were solely dependent on Russian gas. Now that's down to about 1 or 2. So the diversification of sources has been important.
And there are 2 possible scenarios that may play out here. There may be more, but when we talk particularly about energy, one, of course, is that Ukrainian infrastructure is damaged. So those pipelines and the facilities to process that energy are damaged. The other is that Russia uses limitations on exports to try and hamper any sort of export through to Europe. What in the short term is the most damaging? One would assume it's those sanctions, as opposed to a long-term problem of the infrastructure itself being damaged.
The sanctions, it depends on what the sanctions do and what the sanctions are. I mean, it's in Europe's interest to have sanctions and to make sure that this conflict doesn't become worse than it is already, and that the saber rattling stays just saber rattling and doesn't escalate into something more dramatic. And damaging infrastructure would be really catastrophic, but also for Ukraine, not just for Europe. So if sanctions were to include something like refusing to allow Nord Stream 2 pipeline to open, and also there was damage to the infrastructure that goes through Ukraine, this would have a serious impact on gas supplies to Europe. There's no question about that. But it would depend on what the nature of the sanctions is, how far they go. And the Europeans are, of course, not going to want to impose sanctions that hurt themselves as much as they hurt the Russians. It's a real double-edged sword, depending on what the sanctions are.
Yes, and I'm looking at some response already suggesting that Russia is already weaponizing those exports of gas. It's not been helpful. Europe is in the midst of an energy crisis. It's already playing politics with its exports. So whatever happens now, it's already doing that.
True. I mean, if you want to look at the silver lining in the cloud, one advantage of high energy prices is that this should encourage more energy efficiency improvements, drive forward consumers to introduce new insulation, reduce the amount that they consume, pay attention to the way in which they consume energy, to drive more investment into renewable energy, which is already increasing quite significantly in Europe, which is much, much cheaper, of course. So there are some advantages, but energy poverty in Europe is still a significant problem. It will continue to be so. And so if there's a sudden change to sources of gas this is going to be a significant problem. And gas still composes about 20% in that range of the EU energy mix for the time being, and that will continue to be an important part of the energy mix in Europe over the short and medium term.
Megan, it's really good to have your thoughts. It's such an interesting area and one we'll talk about again. Megan Richards there, thank you for being with us from the German Marshall Fund of the United